Merci à Imetrika et à la Maison de la Tunisie de nous accueillir pour je ne sais plus quelle est l'édition de ce partenariat, mais maintenant c'est une affaire qui maintenant on ne compte plus. Quand on s'aime, on ne compte plus. Welcome to everybody, and we're very happy to have Branko Milanović here, who will present his recent book, and Thomas Piketty will discuss it. Branko told me that he prefers to have his presentation in English, but he would be very happy to take questions in French and to answer also questions in French. So if this is okay with everybody. He mentioned also that he has regular opportunities to talk in French with a friend of his who is from Tunisia. So that's another link. And inequality is, of course, a very important question, raises many questions. It's a very important topic, and it's also a very important topic at PSC. Many scholars investigate the causes of inequality rising, inequality decrease, inequality evolution, and also what policies may be possible to fight against inequalities. But without further delay, I'll just leave the floor to Thomas, who will introduce the speaker and the theme. Thank you.
Okay, merci Pierre-Yves. So apparently we have to speak in English, but as you can see, my English sounds a lot like French, so this should be okay for those of you who are French speaking. So I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to let you speak for like 40-45 minutes, and then I will ask a couple of questions and we will open the floor for discussion. Let me just say, in terms of general introduction, how happy we are to have Branko here. Branko is one of the best specialists in the world of the study of global inequality. He has been working at the World Bank for many years. He's now at CUNY, which is the City University of New York, which is a great public university of New York. So in New York, you all know Columbia and NYU, which are great places, but there's also CUNY, which is a fantastic place, in particular in the area of income distribution. And Branko, with Janet McCormick and other people from the Luxembourg Income Study Group, are doing a great job to develop this area at CUNY. Branko is very well known for many of his work. In particular, maybe the most famous Branko's curve. You can't see it, but that's figure 1.1 of his book, where you see basically a very efficient and impressive summary of inequality dynamics at the global level for the recent decades, showing on one graph what Branko calls in chapter 1 of his book, the rise of the global middle class and the rise of the global plutocrats, which means that if you look at the curve relating who has benefited from growth over the recent decade, you have a peak at the middle class, typically the Chinese middle class, and you have a peak at the very top, and then people in between, in particular the bottom groups or the middle groups in developed countries, and also the bottom groups in the very poorest countries, typically in sub-Saharan Africa, did not benefit too much from growth. So you have this, it looks complicated, but in the end, we are all familiar with this graph, but Branko was the first one to measure it this way, to put it in such a clear graph. Many other people have contributed to the measurement of global inequality, in particular François Bourguignon, who is there in the room, but I think, Branko made really a key contribution to this. So this is graph figure 1.1, chapter 1, and you're going to tell us about the next steps of the book, and then I will ask you questions. So, Branko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Well, thank you for everybody. First, I would like to thank Thomas for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here. I was very also happy to host Thomas in the beginning of his whirlwind tour of the eastern coast of the United States when his book was published. So it is actually, of course, a pleasure to be now back myself on this side of the Atlantic. I'm also I would like to thank Francois for coming, cutting short his vacation and coming here. So let me then start really, as Thomas said, I will have about 40 to 45 minutes. I don't think that anybody can listen to anybody for longer than that. So I want really to stay within that limit, and you tell me when I'm 5 minutes off. Yeah. And even if I don't cover everything, we'll have questions and answers. As Thomas has said, je serais très content vraiment de prendre des questions en français, de répondre en français. J'aurais même essayé de faire toute la présentation en français, une chose que je n'ai pas faite avant, mais je ne pense pas que c'est tellement difficile. Mais tout de même, ce serait plus facile pour moi de le faire en anglais, et à la prochaine, peut-être, je le ferai en français. Okay, after this introduction, let me go, actually, first, I want to start with the structure of my book, which the title you can see, it's Global Inequality. And the structure, which is very difficult to read, but I will explain it in a minute. As Thomas said, actually, I start with the effects of the globalization on global income distribution. And essentially, he already described this first slide, so it's going to save us a little bit of time. And I really described that, who were the beneficiaries. Basically, it is using the data from 1988 to 2011. Now, I have to say the data I will not bother you too much with the data, but the data come from household surveys. It comes from like 120 countries in the world. It is done at every 5-year intervals because, the countries don't produce, some countries produce annual data, but not all do. So you have to have like benchmark years. And then we have, it was part of the work was done with the co-author Christoph Lackner. We have 1988, then 1993, 1998, 2003, 2008, and 2011. So this is actually the database that we use. And on top of that, of course, you use all these surveys from a bunch of countries. You have really to do lots of work. And there are many issues there. I really will not be able to mention even them. The issue of underestimation of the top incomes, the issue of possibly even underestimation of the bottom, the issues of whether you have income or consumption. Is the income always measured the same? And then finally, you have the issue of converting all of that into common currency, which is PPP, so-called purchasing power parity dollars. So there are many technical issues. As I said, I will skip them today because obviously I will be happy to answer some of them during the Q&A part. So I start with that. That's the first chapter, really globalization, the effects of globalization. Then what are the other two, and why do they actually show them, if I can get this to work, like this and like that, sort of in two different kind of halves? Is because global inequality, when you decompose it, it can be decomposed into two parts, and I'm going to use this decomposition a lot. It can be decomposed in inequality within nations. You somehow take inequalities within each country and just add them up with some weights. I will not, there are many procedures to do that. It is a little bit similar to if you had like people in different rooms in this building, and you say, what is the total inequality in this building, okay? Well, total inequality, you get everybody's income. But then the next question you say, okay, how much of that total inequality is due to inequalities within each individual room / country, and how much is due to the fact that maybe everybody in this room is rich and everybody in the other room is relatively poor. So then this is the second decomposition, part of the decomposition. You take the differences between mean country incomes. So the first part is really something that we very much talk about. This is inequality in the US, in Russia, in China, in France. The second part is also very important, and we also talk about that, but in a different context. That's inequality between mean incomes, between France and Tunisia, Morocco and Spain, US and Mexico. And as you can see, actually, already now, I'm going to use that second part to address the issue of migration. So this would be, sort of a right place to address that issue. So that's why I divided this, the next two. This is chapter 2, where I actually talk what are the determinants of inequality within nations over the long term. And then in chapter 3, I talk about also the determinants of differences in mean incomes between the countries over the long term. And then I bring all of this together in chapter 4 and look at the future of global inequality. And even to give the story sort of in advance now a little bit, I actually see the global inequality being shaped by two forces. One, which I developed here, is the long-term Kuznets cycles. And I will explain that in a minute. And the second one is the convergence of mean country income. So it's basically, I think we need to have some kind of a structure when we think about global inequality. We can do calculations and assume growth rates, but really we need a structure. And I think the structure comes from some approach which way the inequality within nations will move in the future and which way mean incomes will move in the future. So this is the structure of the book. Now let me go now to the really, I will go chapter by chapter. Some of that stuff, maybe because of lack of time, I'll skip and go faster. But when you read the book, and by the way, there is a flyer there that you can pick up and get a discount. You can actually read that at your leisure, and then everything will become clear. So let me start with this first graph that Thomas has already described. So that actually he has saved about 2 minutes of my presentation. And this graph really shows you on the horizontal axis percentile of global income distribution. Let's suppose, you can be, probably people here would be 80th, 90th, or maybe 95th percentile or even more in the world. And then, of course, there are people who are very poor who would be actually at the bottom. This is actually by ventiles, by 5%. So people who will be in the bottom 5% in the world, bottom 10% and so on. And then here, you actually look at the change in real terms, in those PPP terms that I mentioned before, between 1988 and 2008. Now, the striking thing is that actually when you see this graph, and I actually derived it the first time I remember still that day, it was June 2012. And I actually knew that, of course, globalization was very good for China and India, that there was already talk about really stagnation of wages in the rich countries. But it's very impressive when you kind of see that in one graph. And that basically graph tells you that story because you notice that, of course, people who have done in percentage terms very well, who have doubled their real incomes, are people around the median of the global income distribution. And it's actually a much bigger group. It's a group between the 40th percentile and 65th. So it's really lots of people. And we're talking about several billion people. And then you noticed actually the people who have, then you kind of look who are the people who are there. And I have now many variants of that graph, so I will again not go into that because there is also an issue. Do we really just compare 1988 to 2008, or do we keep the people so-called groups there from 1988 and see how well they have done? So spare me all these details, but believe me when I say that actually people who are in that middle are generally people from Asia. And of course, to make it simpler, I call it the Chinese middle class. I put middle class under quotes because by Western standards, these are still very poor people. We're talking here about per capita incomes per day of about $4 to $5 to $6. So it's actually even below the poverty line in many, many rich countries. So these are the people whose incomes have doubled over the period of these 25 years. And as I said before, 90% of them come from Asia. This is my point A. Now, the point B is here. These are people who are actually better off, for people about $12 a day. We're talking about 15 or 18 or 20. And this is per capita disposable after-tax income. And when you look at people who are there at that point B, where you almost see no growth, you actually find out that this is like 70% are people from the rich countries, with the lower parts of the distributions, like, for example, lower part of the French distribution. But the three countries stand out because of their size. It's the US, Japan, and Germany. And of course, for the US and Japan, it is well known that there was a period of, particularly for the US, a period of slow growth of the median wage and so on. For Japan, there was a slow growth of the economy overall. But it's less well known that actually German wages at the median have also been stagnant. So the three countries actually stand out, but basically many other rich Western countries have seen the same evolution. And then the last point is that point which Thomas mentioned as well. This is actually the rise of the global plutocracy, where you actually see people who have done very well at the top 1%, global 1%. Now, just to tell you, global top 1% sounds very good, but it's harder to be in the global top 1% in France than to be in the global top 1% globally, because obviously for the global top 1% you have to be among 70 million people in the world, and the threshold is lower. But to be one top 1% in France, you have to be in the top 5 million people over there, 5.5, and the threshold there is high. So it is, another example is that actually 12% of Americans are the part of the global top 1%. Now, why do we study all these points? I will not read all of that. Is that because really it's nice to have a picture, and of course I'm very happy to have seen this picture, to have made this picture, but really we're studying also for political economy or political reasons, because we actually want to address the issues of slow growth among the relatively poor people, and particularly that point B, really absence of growth among the lower parts of the distributions of the rich countries. Now, this has with the political developments, now particularly in the US, but also with the rise of populism in Europe, acquired quite a lot of importance. Because you see this point B as being basically squeezed between, on the one hand, competition from cheaper labor from Asia, which is that point A, which has really grown. I mean, whose incomes have grown, but whose incomes are still, or wages are still below, obviously, those people in Europe or the US. And being squeezed, on the other hand, from their own plutocrats on their own top 1%. So it's actually a very interesting situation, a very uncomfortable situation to be in, because you have really people breathing down your neck to some extent who actually are willing to do work maybe cheaper than you. On the other hand, the top guys in your own countries have actually gone much higher than you. And of course, that is a point which has then generated quite a lot of discussion politically, particularly if you believe, and I'm not going to argue that point, but particularly if you believe that there is a causality between the rise of the middle class in Asia and stagnation of the middle class or working class in the rich countries. And especially if you believe that what happens after China is India, and after India happens Thailand and Vietnam, and then Ethiopia and so forth. So that particular absence of growth, short of some other measures, might actually continue. So these are really the political reasons which I think why we need to actually study that. And of course there is an issue of global plutocracy and so on, so I will skip that. I will then go very quickly just to show you that if you do the same graph in several other versions, I do it here with percentiles, the shape, which is a very unusual shape, because normally this is called the growth incidence curve. Normally these shapes either go downward because everybody sort of basically there is a decline in inequality and the growth is stronger at the bottom, or they are actually the opposite. They are going upward and then essentially means that the growth is higher at the top. But it's very unusual to have this particular pattern. But of course, the world is not a single country. So that pattern is driven, as you already know, is by oftentimes high growth, basically, higher growth rate in China and the rest of Asia, despite the fact that those countries have had increased inequality in themselves, within themselves. So I then extended this graph to 2011. This is outside of the paper that I did with Christoph, and the graph even gets more sort of dramatic because the growth has continued in the emerging economies, particularly of Asia, whereas it has essentially stopped in the rich world between 2008 and 2011. One difference there is that actually the plutocrats now have grown a little bit less compared to the middle, because the plutocrats, the global top 1%, is still overwhelmingly, particularly in the surveys, composed of people from the rich countries. So they are actually still, Chinese and Indians and so others are still relatively few in the numbers in the global top 1%. Now that has of course changed the structure or how the global income distribution looks. And this is the graph that shows that. What you notice there is that now, if you of course, you notice that there is actually something in the middle of the global income distribution, many more people than before, so it's much thicker. So now the global income distribution, this 2011, the red curve, looks more like what you normally find within one country. I'm not saying that it is similar still, but it does actually appear more similar than what Danny Kwok called in the past the twin peaks. Is it actually a very strong number of people who are at very low incomes, and of course quite a few people who are at high incomes. Mind you, this is not countries here ranked. This is individuals ranked. So it's actually as you treat the world as one, as if it were one country. So after this very brief sort of story about what happened in the last 25 years, I have to move to the chapter 2, which deals really with more historical data. In chapter 2, and you will remember, that deals with within national inequality. So we are now shifting gears. We started with global. We now decompose this global and look now what happens to within country inequalities. I'm actually going to, and that really has to be quick now, I have redefined the Kuznets curve, which many of you know, but I will still define it very briefly, into the so-called Kuznets cycles. Now, the Kuznets curve as you know, was originally proposed by Simon Kuznets in the 50s, then later continued by Kravis in the 60s and so on. And the idea was that societies from agricultural societies become richer, they actually become more unequal because the Industrial Revolution happens, you actually move people from rural areas into urban areas, the structure of labor and the intersectoral inequalities in the urban areas are much greater, so inequality goes up. Then societies are sufficiently rich, education kicks in, people want to have social insurance, then the share of capital goes down, then of course inequality declines. The theory, as you will see that in a moment, I'll show you the graphs, it actually did seem reasonably okay with the data up to 1980s. The problem with the Kuznets cycle as originally defined was that it could not explain the increase in inequality which took place from the 1980s onwards in the rich countries. And it was a little bit ironic, and I don't want to go spend a lot of time on that, but it was a little bit ironic that we actually, by the time we rejected the hypothesis, we started having long-term data for the countries, which in my opinion can actually allow us to reformulate the hypothesis as I've done here. Because before 1980, 1985, we didn't have long-term data, and we were studying the Kuznets hypothesis on the cross-sectional data. And there was lots of dissatisfaction with the results. Now, let me go with that. I define it in both societies with a stagnant mean income and societies with a rising mean income. In the stagnant mean income, the Kuznets cycles look very much like essentially Malthusian cycles. And the issue there is that actually I argue that they are fundamentally different in the sense that in the societies with stagnant mean income, these cycles are driven by non-economic forces, of which I have two, and most important, one is epidemics, which, as you know, like the Black Plague, reduce number of people, then increase the relative scarcity of labor, and then make inequality, because wages go up, make inequality less. And the second ones are wars, which of course have had the same impact of reducing inequality, generally speaking, in the modern societies as well. Now, to give you an idea, but in the modern societies, we have economic forces that kick in. So the difference between the stagnant societies and the modern means after the Industrial Revolution, is that actually economics starts performing now and creating these cycles, not only wars or epidemics. Now, to give you an idea how stagnant societies look like, I took this data that was done by Giovanni Vecchi within the same structure, so I don't take like different countries, I take one country, and that was Italy. And Italy, of course, was a relatively developed country in the Middle Ages, and we are talking here really about Italy as some kind of a Italy, it could be northern cities in the 1400s and so on. And that's basically how the picture looks like. So that's as you can see, there was no growth up to 1800 and something. Then, sorry, I have this is a very important graph which doesn't want, it happened to me once before. Anyway, that's very unfortunate. But there is there is here a graph that was actually from Spanish inequality going back to 1400s. And what you notice there is actually when you look at that graph and the data which are actually taking inequalities approximated by the ratio between land rents and wage, is that you see that precise undulations of Kuznets waves, which are driven by things like wars, some commercial expansion, epidemics, and so on. So that's what you see against the time. But because Spanish income has been constant over the time, and then when you do it against income, the same data actually give you some pattern which has no sense whatsoever. And why? Because when you have an unchanged mean income, the movements of the inequality there, pictured against that mean income are simply up and down without any particular shape. So that, for me, is really the very important kind of a sort of difference between the modern societies and pre-industrial revolution or societies with stagnant mean income. It's actually Kuznets cycles do appear in time, but not against mean income, essentially because the mean income was fixed. And this is something, if you do it against the mean income, as you normally would do in the Kuznets cycles, you will find absolutely nothing. But when you move to the modern societies, as you will see that in a minute, you would actually find these cycles displayed against the mean income. So what I already said before is that actually in the pre-industrial societies, Kuznets waves were driven by essentially non-economic forces. They are very akin to the similar to the Malthusian waves, and there was very little room for the increase of inequality because of another approach, which was the explanation, which is that there was inequality possibility frontier. In other words, when you're a very poor society, you really have very limited income, and even the rich people, even if they take the entire surplus, the gaps or the Gini coefficient of the overall distribution is not going to be very high. So we come now to the societies, modern societies, or the societies with the rising mean income. Here, I define the Kuznets waves. They are first visible when you plot it against per capita income. They are driven by technological revolutions, and I would argue that we are now currently witnessing the second modern Kuznets wave in the rich societies, driven by the essentially IT revolution. In the similar way, and the movement of labor from manufacturing into much more heterogeneous services, which is similar to the original sort of idea that the first wave was driven by the first industrial revolution, or the first technological revolution, and movement of labor from agriculture to industry. So we have some similarities, I believe, between the second wave and the first wave. That, of course, leads you, of course, they are also moved by globalization, politics, and policies and politics. And that I think I would also argue that what Kuznets saw, because he obviously wrote in the 60s, he essentially saw one curve. But I think with hindsight now and 60 years after Kim, we actually can see two, and we can project, and by looking at the past, can actually argue that there were waves, and these waves obey certain regularities and are driven by factors that we can also define. Now, this is a big graph, and some of them I mentioned. I wanted actually just to mention the factors that I believe drive the downward part of the cycle. So for the past, I already mentioned the wars and epidemics. For the present, there are issues that are actually identified really in the 60s already, then continued with Timbergen and the others. And it was widespread education, social pressure, and then politics, socialism, free trade trade unions. There was a recent paper actually looking also at the increase in inequality in the rich societies being driven by the reduction in the trade union density, aging and demand for social protection, possible low-skill bias technological change, and cultural and ideological factors like pay norms and the others. So there are all of them. None of that is something totally original. What is new is that actually you put it in the context of the waves. And of course what is new is that you actually look at the waves both in the ancient societies and, or not ancient actually, pre-modern societies and modern societies. And then you define what I called I will call that in a minute, benign and malign forces. The malign forces are obviously the forces of epidemics and wars. The benign forces are the usual economic forces of rising education, greater social transfers, and demographics, trade unions, and so on. So I think we have to keep that, and it will become, I think, apparent in a moment why I think it's important to keep the difference between the forces that can drive inequality down, which are malign or bad in themselves, like wars, and the forces that can drive inequality down, but which are good in themselves, like higher education. So let me then show you very briefly these relationships, long-term data that we all have in some countries, for some countries, actually rich countries, even as recently of a couple of years ago, particularly for the United States, but which now allow us to extend our gaze into the past. And this is simply the Gini coefficient based on the, on the data from household surveys, or more recently, of course, from the, annual household surveys in the UK. You will notice, of course, that peak, which was actually in 1867 or thereabouts. We have data from 1867, but it could be 1860 or it could be 1890. But we know that the last part of the 19th century was the peak of the British inequality. Then, of course, you see the decline, which is, so this will be the first cycle. And then the bottom is 1978, and then you see the second cycle, which actually with the increase, which is, of course, still way below the level of the peak of the late 19th century. This is the graph for the United States. Similar pattern. The and I will actually emphasize that in a minute, the 1979 represents the year with the lowest inequality. The highest inequality is here. It's either like at the time of the Great Depression or 1860. Now, the interesting part is actually these numbers here for the US come really from a study by Peter Lindert and Jeff Williamson, which is actually published right now. So this is really something that we didn't have in the past. As I mentioned before, we discarded Kuznets' hypothesis actually before even having long-term data for many of the countries. I want also to show you some countries which don't have such a sharp increase in the present time, like Italy, for example. And what is actually nice with that data set, it comes from Brandolini and Vecchi, is that actually it is the same authors, same data, so you don't have the issue that I had with the UK and the US, that you have actually to use a part of the data from one source and combine it with another source, which is always, of course, problematic. And then even more dramatic, actually, is when you look at these graphs in log terms, because then you, of course, put on your horizontal axis incomes in logs, which gives kind of growth rates to some extent, and then you notice actually the waves, I think the wave-like movement even more dramatically. And you notice it, for example, that the US inequality, as we know, of course, from Thomas and Atkinson's and other people's work, is now basically, whether we look at the household surveys and we look at the top 1%, is at the level which was close to historical peak level. But that's not the case for the UK, where actually today's inequality, although is in the upward trend of the second Kuznets wave, is still significantly below the peak of the 19th century. And to give you an idea, the UK peak of the 19th century was today's level of Brazil. In the Q&A, we can actually argue, I don't believe that the second Kuznets wave would ever drive the rich countries to the peaks that were the peaks of the 19th century, and there are some, I think, good reasons to believe that, but just to give you an idea, it is very hard to believe that UK would go to a peak of Brazil, actually have an inequality which is similar to Brazil's inequality. Now, this table is an important table, but it's kind of hard to read, but what this table does, it shows you essentially the duration of the waves of the first wave and the beginning of the second. I would actually like you to focus on the sort of, let's say, only on one country. Let's look at the United States here. And focus on that the first peak was, as I mentioned before, at the Gini of 51, approximately. And 1933, I believe, is the year with the largest inequality, although some people argue 1929. But, it's either before just before the Depression, if you believe that actually it was driven by the top, or if it's driven by people who became unemployed and with no incomes on the bottom, it could be 1933. So it's either 29 or 33. Then the bottom inequality in the US was 35. So we are talking here about 16 Gini point decline, which is enormous decline. When these things go by 2 Gini or 3 Gini points, and we can ascertain that it's not something fluke that happened in 1 year, this is a big change. If we have had a 16-point decline, it's enormous. In the case of the UK, the decline was even larger, But let's stick with the US. And then approximate number of the downswing is about 50 years, because from 1933 to 1980, approximately. And the reduction, as I mentioned before, is 16 Gini points. Now, how much did real income increase in the US over that period is by 4 times. Now, why this graph I think is important? Because I've listed other countries that I'm not going to read now. Again, when you buy the book, you will see it there. It's actually striking, and it's never happened in the history, and maybe it will never happen again, that you had, over a period of 50 or 100 years, a tremendous decline of inequality accompanied by a phenomenal increase in mean income. We tend to think, particularly economists, that Auckland's law of the trade-off between mean income and inequality holds, that you can have a little bit more of mean income only if inequality goes up, that there is a trade-off. But over the long term, if you look at these numbers, there is no trade-off. Actually, it's the opposite. It was really that the two things happened simultaneously. As I said before, it was a historical development. Now, today we are witnessing another historical development, which is growth of China and India. But that growth is accompanied by an increase in inequality. whereas, as you can see, growth in the rich countries over that period from the 19th century to 1978, 1980 was accompanied by significant, dramatic declines in inequality. And that gives you here, I just did the growth rates over 10-year period. So it's actually, decennial or decadal growth rates plotted against the decline in the Gini points over also 10 years. So essentially what it shows you that on the average, US actually grew by about 30% every 10 years over that period of the Kuznets decline, and its Gini went down by 3% on the average. So these are really quite dramatic numbers, which of course, as you can imagine now, are being reversed because now we are having, and this is the last part of the graph, we are having a strong or moderate or modest, but always an increase in inequality in all rich countries from the period where actually, which is actually very coincidental. As you can see, the trough, the minimum of inequality was between 79 and 83, I believe, for practically all the countries. I have 11 countries there. So basically something happened between late 70s and mid-1980s that pushed all rich countries towards an increase in inequality. In some cases, it was a very dramatic increase. In some cases, it was more moderate, but nobody stayed at the level where it was, and certainly nobody had inequality lower than it was at that point. So these are, I think, actually things that I already mentioned, so I will skip it. These are the changes that drive the Kuznets first and the second Kuznets wave. I wanted also only to mention one issue on which I spent some time, and this is this TOP, Technology, Openness, Progress, and easy to remember in English acronym because it's TOP, so everybody will remember it. And obviously, these are the forces that actually drive inequality up or down. Technology, as we know, there are many studies, particularly for wages, the technological changes behind the increase in inequality, many studies about globalization or openness, and many studies about policy change or institutional changes. I argue, actually, not to great length, but I could argue more about that. I believe that whereas conceptually they're all possible to disentangle, I think that in real life that the three of them are really going together. So when, for example, you have recent papers showing that the decline in the cost of capital has led to greater capital utilization and the increase in the capital share, that I think can be explained, and actually it is explained to a large extent in the paper, by essentially ability to outsource production of physical capital goods to the places with low wage. So in other words, if you had to produce these capital goods in Sweden, then, or Norway, they would be much more expensive, and your iPhone would not cost like $400, but maybe $900. And there will be fewer people having the iPhones, and there will be fewer people doing applications because they would not be as useful as when everybody has the iPhone. So the point, I think, is that actually I believe that the three forces, technology, globalization, and policy, go together, and we actually have to think of them as together, although, as I said, conceptually, we can distinguish between them. So I also use, this is like the end of my chapter 2. I also, of course, argue that the first Kuznets wave is something that is that China and Brazil are examples of countries that are at the end of that wave. And as you can see, actually, in Brazil, we have documented decline in inequality over the last 10 years. And I think that China may be at that peak, at the point where actually it is beginning, or it might begin to actually reduce inequality. But obviously, it's hypothetical. I will give you maybe later some reasons why I believe that inequality in China might start going down, and why I believe that inequality in the US has still not reached the peak. But obviously, this is a little bit speculative. These are the issues about the future. Okay, finally, I will not talk about that, but it's actually an issue that actually I like very much, and I might lead to some other work, is what I call the endogeneity of World War I. Now, World War I, as we know from Thomas' book, plays a crucial role, because essentially World War II, which then, of course, continues on with the sort of driving the decline in inequality in the rich countries, is somehow like simply the second half of the same football game. I hope we will not go into the overtime, but it's not impossible. But the endogeneity, in my case, means that I believe that the inequality, which was present in non-belligerent countries, which was very high, led to the sort of basically imperialist expansion, and that imperialist expansion led to the war. So this is the story which, of course, you have found, you have in Rosa Luxemburg, or even earlier in Hobson and then Lenin later. But whether you buy the story or not, I'm not selling the book or my argument on that, and actually I expanded that story, but my editor thought it might lead, because everybody in the world has an opinion about the causes of World War I. So, you know, you don't want to have your book become a book which deals with that. But it is in the context of the Kuznets waves, and that's why I called it endogeneity of World War I. So that, in other words, you don't need to go into all the details, but just to believe that inequality was something which was behind the domestic policies which then led to World War I. And that, of course, has it's a slide that just added. It's sort of epistemological challenge of inequality, which was prompted by my friend Chico Ferreira, is that actually that in the approach that I followed here is essentially an approach that is based on sort of looking at the key elements that I believe are driving inequality, but we really cannot, I believe, cannot go for a strong causality there, or because simply inequality is such a difficult, multifaceted problem that any attempt to explain inequality through simple sort of several relationships is bound to be very, very limited. So essentially, I think we are there dealing, either we want to be very limited and have very simple relationships, and we cannot explain that much of it, or we actually have to go into some kind of a broader narrative which kind of pulls down essential features but cannot really establish a strong causality. I think that's an issue that actually will probably plague all our attempts to work on inequality in the future, but I think it's worthwhile keeping it. Now, Thomas, how many minutes do I still have?
How much do you need? Like 15 minutes?
15 that would be great, actually.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm very grateful that you're probably giving me some extra. You're like the fourth referee. You're giving, the home team advantage. That was this joke when I'm a big football fan, but I remember this joke when Real Madrid won the Champions League in the 4 minutes and 35 seconds overtime. So then the joke was, how many minutes of overtime they would be? And they said, until they equalize. So, so until I finish. Okay, I will now move to the chapter 3. Now, the chapter 3, as I mentioned before, is a chapter that deals with differences in mean country incomes. Now, why is it called, as they called it, from Karl Marx to Frantz Fanon and back to Marx with a question mark, is because essentially, because of, there's another graph that is missing. These are really my best graphs, so I have to explain them. The graph actually shows you the composition of global inequality, which is, as I said before, which you take the total amount of inequality between citizens in the world and divide it between inequality which is due to differences within and differences between. Now, the differences within I call for simplicity class, because it's differences within countries. Some, in the past, nobility or clergy or peasants and so on. And then differences between the countries. It's really, as I said before, differences in mean incomes between poor and rich countries. Now, what is interesting there is that you go back to Francois' work with Christian Morisson, and then they had Gini, they start from 1820s, and then you have a Gini of, like, suppose 50. Now, out of this 50, about 30 or 25 or 30 is due to within national inequalities. So let's suppose broadly half and half. When you go back, you go now to the situation today, or even more dramatically to the situation at the very end of the 20th century. Well, global inequality is like 70 Gini points, and 60 Gini points of that are due to inequalities between nations. So that's why I called it, this is the Frantz Fanon moment, because it's really the third world versus the rich world. It's essentially inequalities today, and especially at the end of the 20th century, were really dominantly explained by inequalities between the countries. So this is an issue, again, historically going back when, Marx, actually Engels noticed the first, what he called, the embourgeoisement of the British working class. It is simply that the poor people in Britain became relatively well off to compare to poor people, or what you might call middle class, in Sri Lanka or China or India. So it was a very remarkable period where most of the global inequality increase was driven by the rising gaps between country incomes. Now, that period actually is now, we are going a little bit, and in 50 years we might actually go back to the situation which existed at the beginning of the middle of the middle of the 19th century, because now we are actually at the beginning stages of two movements which are very interesting. On the one hand, because of the rise of the emerging or resurgent Asia, as Angus Madison called it, and because of relatively low growth in rich countries, we are having the between element being squeezed down. And technically, I mean, I'm actually mentioning China is now sort of joined the European Union because China's GDP per capita has now reached the level of the poorest EU countries. So it's a remarkable moment in history, actually, compared to what is 100 years ago. So we are now going on that downward slope of the global inequality, driven essentially by Asia. At the same time, inequalities within many countries, we have seen for the rich countries, but we could add, to that Russia and China and others, are increasing. So if you kind of were to project, I'm not sure that it should be done, but let's suppose for another 50 years that you have the convergence of the world, then this between component would shrink, and then if inequalities continue rising in most of the large countries, the within component would expand. So overall global inequality might go down, but compositionally, structurally, it might look like it looked in the early 19th century. So that was why I called it from Karl Marx to Fanon and back to Marx. Fanon to me was really an interesting person. I couldn't actually find a better one who kind of epitomizes that really peak difference between rich and poor countries. Now, that problem of the fact that most of your income is determined by where you were born or where you live, and it's basically the same thing because only 4% of the people in the world are living in the countries where they were not born, leads to issues that I will go very briefly, what I call the citizenship rent, which is basically the issue of global equality of opportunity. And this is an interesting, I think, an obvious issue. We talk about inequality of opportunity all the time. You say, well, we should not have a gender discrimination in France. We should not have, ethnic discrimination, racial discrimination, or any other. But we never talk about, this is all within the nation state. We don't actually even use the terms of global inequality of opportunity. Now, I'm not arguing necessarily that I'm in favor of global equality of opportunity, because political philosophers have dealt with it, and they're divided. But we actually do have to to realize that we implicitly say that equality of opportunity ends at the borders of nation states. And it's a big issue. Do we really say that very clearly? There is no equality of we are not concerned with the fact that exactly the same individual in Tunisia and France would have an income which is different by a factor of 5. So that's a big issue to say, and that's why I actually call this citizenship rent. And then it leads to the issue of migration, because migration comes naturally if you sort of see economic migration. I'm not talking about Syrian war and other things, but really economic migration as an attempt to people, obviously, to increase their incomes and to sort of take a part of that citizenship rent that belongs to the others. So that actually locates, and that's actually a very important point, locates the issue of migration within the issue of globalization and global inequality. And actually, I would like to keep it there and not to treat it as some kind of weird element that just comes now because people just start moving and they just want all to come to Europe or to come to the United States. Now, this is simply what I already said. Actually, in empirical data, you can actually show that basically you can explain a large part of your income simply by the dummy variable of where you live. So essentially, if you put all people in the world and use no other variable except where these people come from, you actually have very high percentage of explanatory power of what is your income. So this is called citizenship rent that I've already explained, and that leads to the issue of global inequality of opportunity. Now, the interesting part here is that actually this has been discussed by political philosophers. I have only one slide, and I see that Thomas is checking the time. So I will just do it very quickly. There is a little bit of a conflict, and I'm simply rehashing between what, because we have to start with roles essentially there. In theory of justice, he rejects all arguments for the family, intergenerational family transmission of wealth. So let me take, this is a big word, intergenerational transmission of family wealth. All the arguments are rejected. Because actually, if we really want to have what he calls democratic equality, we have really to compensate for that fully. And that's why we are in favor of inheritance tax, and that's why we are in favor of equal access to education and all of that. But when he comes to the study of the world in the law of peoples, it is really kind of almost uncanny that all the arguments that he has rejected in the previous book, he now uses them. He says, well, if we really allow that rich countries have an obligation to help poor countries, then the poor countries are not going to work. And well, that was the argument that the right wing also would say to him, well, we allow people actually not to give them social transfers in the country, so they are going to stop working. So there is really moral hazard there. So it's very interesting. Now, I know what was the reason that he rejected that, because in his view of the world, citizens gather behind the veil of ignorance. And if you're not a citizen, if you're looking at the world, there is no veil of ignorance for the world. The world meets, as we are like in different rooms, as representative of different rooms. So we send one guy from this room to the other room, they send another guy. But we never meet as people. So, you know, there is a tension between these two issues, which was present in the political philosophy, but was not really very much discussed by economists. But now, we economists have numbers to show that. So I think this is our advantage compared to the political philosophers. Now, as I said before, that leads to the issue of migration. And of course, I view migration as simply from the global perspective. If you take perspective of the world, or purely sort of cosmopolitan perspective, it's a matter of indifference for you whether a person has become rich in his own or her own country, or has moved to another country to become rich. It's absolutely equivalent. And then in that sense, development or migration are the same thing. Now, politically, obviously, it is not equivalent, as we know, because there are political communities and the world is organized in nation states. So that has led me, this is the borders, which I did 10 years ago, so I didn't even include, and I intentionally don't want to include, because then it would seem really like I'm just copying other people, whereas I want them to look like they're copying me. The other borders, which are, of course, sprung up in Europe. And these are the borders between the countries with largest gaps in mean income, and basically, obviously, in all these cases, you have fences or minefields or other things. And so let me just come to this last point, is that then, if you actually believe that migration is a very powerful tool for the reduction, as we know that, for the reduction in global poverty and global inequality, and that populations in rich countries are generally reluctant to share that citizenship premium, whether it is really economically motivated or culturally motivated for whatever reason, then I think you realize that there is a trade-off. You can have a situation where actually there is like everybody who comes to France or to the US immediately becomes a citizen and gets all the rights that everybody else has, in which case there will be certainly a pressure to minimize such a migration. Or you can have a situation where actually people come, is either different formulas, temporary workers, or they are obliged to send part of their income back, or they are actually obliged to pay higher tax rates, or whatever. They don't get full citizenship rights. Then there will be, I believe, greater willingness to accept them. So in other words, there is this trade-off between the full citizenship rights and the willingness of acceptance. And if you believe that actually migration is something good, then you have to find a position on this curve which would satisfy native population and allow maximum migration at that level of satisfaction of native population. So I think that it is important to think of, again, the current migration crisis as located within the space of globalization and global inequality, and it's important to realize that there is a trade-off between these two variants. I know that being accused, actually, that I'm arguing for a solution that is to some extent implemented in the Gulf countries, and if you wish, I mean, I'm not arguing for that, but it is actually, to some extent, leaving aside very discriminatory approach where you actually seize people's passports. That's not something that obviously one would argue in favor. But I'm saying that obviously these countries, by allowing huge percentage of number of people to come do actually contribute to the reduction in global poverty and global inequality. So now I'm at the very end, and I will actually skip that part because I've already gone over time. So I would just give you an idea what that last chapter does. Actually, there is a 5th chapter, but I will forget about that. What the chapter 4 does is actually discusses the future evolution of global inequality in light on these forces of convergence, and looks at the forces which I believe will continue shaping increasing inequality in the US, forces which might lead China to a reduction of inequality, and the issues of the hollowing out of the middle class and the political issues of populism and plutocracy. So that chapter is to some extent maybe even most fun to read, but the problem is that I cannot come to tell you how fun it is to read before I tell you what was in the previous chapters, and it does take all my time.
No,
so
please take another 5 minutes if you
okay, 5 minutes. Okay, convergence. There are 2 forces, convergence and the Kuznets waves. Now, convergence, this is the usual graph. Chinese are catching up with the US. This is different, 8th decile and so on, versus US 2nd, but you know, this is well known. Now, what is actually nice, and this is not well known, is this graph that I did, between China and the, how did it go now? Between China and the US is the growth rate of China today. This is actually, okay, let me explain what it is. It is GDP per capita, which is here, let's suppose, $2,000. In the US, it was a GDP per capita of 1810. This is 1800, this is 1810. So US had that GDP per capita. China had that GDP per capita in 1985, let's say. The growth rate of China at the income levels of the US, that the 2 countries shared income levels, was 7 or 8%, whereas the US growth rate at that time was 2%. What does it sort of illustrate? It illustrates that when you are far from the production possibility frontier, you can grow at 8%, and if the US was very close to production possibility frontier in 1800, then actually it could grow at much lower rate of growth. Although, as you can see, US rate of growth was actually accelerating there. And essentially, the US by 1941 reached the level that China in 2011 is. So this is simply growth rates of China and the US at the same levels of income, which illustrates the convergence, basically convergence economics. Now, this graph shows you the difference in growth rates between the emerging countries, except China, because again, it's not only driven by China compared to the OECD countries. And as you can see, this graph, if you look at this graph, you might not know what it is, but this, when it is above 0, that simply shows that these countries are growing faster. And it has been the case for 35 years now. So if you believe that convergence economics are not going to continue, you have to have a very strong opinion that there will be some change, which is going to be a fairly significant change, that is going to reverse a tendency which was going on for 35 years. So that's why I believe that the convergence economics are going to actually determine very much what will, not determine, but they influence very much what will happen to inequality. Now, finally, for the US, 5 elements which I believe will keep US inequality on the rising path, and maybe some of them are also present in France. The first one is the rising share of capital income. So it was obviously also pointed out a lot in Thomas' book. It has basically been established that in the last 30 years there has been an increase in the share of capital. Now, the problem with that is that capital concentration is so high. You know, it would not be a problem if all of us had the same share of capital of a nation. Then the rising share of that particular source is not a problem. It's actually reducing inequality. But the thing is that actually capital is very heavily concentrated, and it's very heavily concentrated in the hands of people who are rich. And if you look at the concentration of Gini of capital income in all rich countries, and I have a different paper on that, it's incredibly high. We're talking about the Ginis of 85 or 90. We don't have these Ginis in any real world except for the capital income. So that's the first force. The second force. Then another point which is very interesting is the rising association of high capital and labor incomes in the hands of the same people. That was from paper by Atkinson and Lackner, where actually you have the same people who are in the top, and this is a nice slide here. Where is that slide? Well, that's my one is also missing. Where you actually see that probability, if you're in the top 1% by labor, you're almost sure to be in the top 10% by capital income. So that has not been the case 30 years ago. Finally, increasing homogamy, which is an interesting phenomenon where actually you have more and more people of the same income level of education marrying each other, which of course also increases inequality. And of course, finally, the political element of the rich being able to buy policies they like. So I think I will stop definitely now here. And I would like really to thank you for, first Thomas, for giving me extra time, and to you for being patient with me until the end. So thank you very much.